Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're getting into the Miles Morales clone saga because you guys wanted me to get back into it like after King in Black, so for that reason we're definitely checking it out. But also a lot has happened since the last time we talked Miles Morales before the King in Black tie-in, but for a lot of that stuff I'll just fill you in as we go. But also if you want me to go back and cover any of those things more in depth, just let me know in the comments after the video and we can just circle back around. And with that being said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so you can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so getting into part 1 of the Miles Morales clone saga. Like, even though it starts in issue 25, it's really kind of been building up for a while now, and like kind of from issue 8, but as we kind of just go along and get through it, like I'll reference back to what we need to when we need to. And if it gets too crazy, I'll just go back to where we left off on the playlist and we'll just fill it all in from there. But for now, just going into it, I want to start off from issue 24 because that issue bridges what we had seen from issue 23 within King in Black, and it snaps everything right back on the path of heading into the Miles Morales clone saga. Because in issue 24, it picks up after the conclusion of King in Black, but even with doing so, it acknowledges the destruction of that event and also the near death match between Miles and Kamala, with them catching up shortly after as former teammates from the champions. But also with like the way that this is set up, I feel like Kamala was kind of brought in to be like this observation or this additional perspective, if you will, as someone who's close to Miles but also who notices something's going on. Because at one point when Kamala challenges Miles to a game of one-on-one, to where she also insists that they suit up so they can use their powers during the game and not make it obvious that they're Miss Marvel and Spider-Man, who by the way, Miles is pretty tough to defend when he starts cloaking in the game. Because even though you can see the ball, like when you're on defense, you're supposed to be watching a person's hips and their torso area, especially if you got a fancy dribbler, because the way they're looking and throwing their head, like that's not it. Everywhere they're showing you the ball, that's not it. And the nail in the coffin is if you're doing a crossover and you sell somebody on that quick step in the direction that you're not going. So with Miles doing all this and being invisible at the same time, like Kamala didn't have a chance. But she asked for it though. Like she wanted to hoop while using powers with Spider-Man. So even if he didn't have handles before, like he got them now. He's Spider-Man. But while they're out there, they kind of got to put the game to a stop when they hear somebody nearby calling for help after a building had recently collapsed. So when Kamala and Miles make their way over there, Kamala then hears that there are people still alive under the wreckage, and because of that, her and Miles are able to help these people out and get them out of there. But after doing this, when they were talking to some of the people who lived in this building, they had then found out like the floors were very faulty and there's a number of things that the landlord just wouldn't fix, which was already putting the tenants and their families in danger. And because of that, Miles was like, okay, so what's this dude's name? I'm gonna have a talk with him. And it's not too long after to where Kamala and Miles find this guy. And initially when they do, Kamala, like she tries to tell Miles to kind of like take it easy, and mainly because recently the government, they've been like cracking down on younger teenage heroes, with a lot of them either getting hurt or killed. So for that reason, recently there's been this whole thing with Dum Dum Dugan and the government stopping teenagers from doing the whole superhero thing. But Miles isn't worried about that, for one, because regardless of if they talk to this guy or not, that's something they're gonna have to deal with either way. But with Miles confronting the landlord for the building on Mott Street with the faulty stairway that nearly killed a mother and her child, this strikes a nerve with Miles for a couple of reasons. Because for one, he's recently become an older brother, with us getting the introduction to his little sister, Billy, earlier within this series. But then on top of that, like just throughout this whole series of Miles Morales Spider-Man, like Miles has been going through some things. Because also you had this encounter with the Assessor, who had abducted Miles and put him through like this rigorous training, or more so rigorous testing, in order to study Miles and his different abilities, which was something that really took a toll on Miles even after he was saved by his father and his uncle, to where after he got out and he got back home, he had still needed to take some time off from doing superhero anything. And even with Miles trying to take that time off, that was also cut short because of everything going on with Ultimatum and your Ultimate's Green Goblin. But because of Miles carrying all of this and more, and then taking that through King in Black, there's quite a few unprocessed things that he's kind of just holding with him this whole time. And it more or less comes out when he snaps on this landlord and just destroys the guy's car. But when this wraps up, we get like the moment where Kamala and Miles are kind of talking through things. It's also here where Miles expresses a bit more about how he feels as far as his frustrations with like, is no matter how much they do, there's always someone else out there still getting hurt. which is more or less kind of the job because there is no like definitive end to being a hero in a sense, because there's literally always something happening. But after Miles gets home after spending the day with Kamala, he gets home to his parents, who at first are just kind of staring at him with kind of the "what's wrong with you, what were you thinking" kind of look, and after that they just run in and hug him, which initially is very random and weird. But when they then show him the news to where it's been reported that Spider-Man has kidnapped a scientist, which then shows him why exactly they're bugging out. But of course Miles doesn't know anything about this, and he's just as confused because it wasn't him. And shortly after, when Genki shows up telling Miles that he's got to talk to him because they haven't seen each other since the beginning of the King in Black tie-in, to where at the time, like we talked about, Genki was trying to tell Miles the whole thing about him dating Barbara, which is also why he showed up here now. But when Genki pops up like, "Miles, I gotta talk to you, it's important," Miles initially thinks it's about the breaking news, but as it turns out, Genki is just as surprised to see it as well. In between the two of them, it kind of shifts the conversation again to where they go upstairs to try to figure it out, because this new information about another Spider-Man kidnapping a scientist, it's a bit more important than the whole situation of Genki talking to Barbara. But while they're figuring this out, Genki discovers that this definitely has to do with cloning, much like what they'd seen with the Assessor, and also that the scientist who was kidnapped, that he won't be much of any use without proprietary tech, which he had helped develop. And because of that, Genki and Miles kind of got an idea of where this clone could be heading next. But just before Miles heads out, Genki's phone starts blowing up, and it's Barbara, who's texting him and sending all kind of kissy faces. And with seeing this, like, this is how Miles finds out, rather than Genki actually telling him, even though we saw Genki try to tell him in the beginning of the King in Black tie-in. And with seeing this, it does cause Miles to go off again, but he does catch himself before he goes too far with his best friend and like punch his head off or anything like that, because that's just one of those things you can't you can't take that back. But after Miles gets this help from Genki to where now he knows at least where to start with checking out the laboratory to where the kidnapped scientist had helped develop some proprietary tech. But when Miles gets there, the place is already trashed, and the couple of scientists who are still there, they're terrified when they see Miles, and they're telling them that he did this and to get away from him. But before Miles can even explain himself, Spider-Man shows up, attacking Miles because he believes Miles is the clone. And it's kind of funny and endearing at the same time to see Peter elbow Miles in the face while asking, "What have you done with the real Spider-Man?" Because Peter is sincerely worried about Miles' safety while elbowing Miles in the face. Like, if I find out he's hurt. But it also doesn't help that like one of the scientists who got injured, he's rooting for OG Spider-Man, telling him to get this guy, he nearly killed me. And I mean, at that point, I would have just webbed dude's mouth shut because he not helping. But what I also like is like during this matchup between Peter and Miles, we get a bit of a callback, or a couple of callbacks actually, to like what we'd seen in the first Spider-Man when 616 Peter went to the 1610 and he got his first introduction to Miles being able to turn invisible in his Venom blast. And we learn here that Peter's at least gotten better at combating the invisible, the cloaking part. But in the case of the Venom blast, that's one of the things like it gets him every time. But when this happens and Miles mentions a couple things that would have only been known between him and Peter, this then confirms with Peter that this is actually Miles. But then with the scientists realizing that they're in a safe space, they then tell them about the other Spider-Man who is threatening them, who they also mentioned had knives. And immediately Miles tells Peter they gotta go so they can catch the trail of this guy and hopefully stop him before he gets too far away. And after they leave, Miles catches up Peter on much of what he's been through since they last talked, and also about Miles' situation with the Assessor, who had captured Miles and studied him, to where at the time he had used that research to create a clone who Miles had to fight a while back. But Miles doesn't believe that this is the same one because that initial clone was like a one-off. But with hearing this, Peter, who has more experience with clones than he probably is proud to share. But then when he tries to tell Miles a bit about his experience, it's then here where they run into Miles' more recent clone, who's not exactly a perfect copy, with him having a bit of skin hanging off here and there. And when they see him, and Peter more or less is like, "Hey man, your face falling off, let me get that for you." And immediately after that, dude just attacks. And when he does this, he immediately surprises them with like the Clayface kind of goopy deforming and reforming attack. And all this guy says is glurp, by the way. And now for whatever reason, I just want to go back and watch Batman the Animated Series. Like, the Clayface episode was just a classic. But with Miles and Peter going up against this clone, they run into a number of problems, because for one, with him reforming so much and so quickly, he's hard to get a hold of. But then on top of that, he's also immune to Miles' Venom blast. And because of that, the only way to kind of stop this guy or contain him As it turns out, it's really just for them to web him up like crazy so that they can hold this guy down and ask him some questions. And with seeing them there, like, you have this moment to where Peter, like, he kind of jokes about it, saying like, oh, he looks so cute, like snuggled up for bedtime. But on the flip side, Miles is like legit freaked out, like standing this close to a clone, like a nearly exact copy of himself staring at him right back in the face. And just before Miles gets to punching on this clone, like Peter pulls him back, like, hey man, we don't do that. And when this happens and Miles tells him like, you don't understand, Peter is then cut off once again before he can make another Clone Saga reference. But Peter's cut off when he's hit by this gas, which doesn't hit Miles as hard. But when it happens, it gives Miles' clone a chance to get away. And as the clone swings away, he's like, glurp. Which I thought was just hilarious. Almost like he's bragging a little bit. But as the clone swings away, Miles just chases right after him, and Peter tells him to wait up, but Miles chases after him, following the screams of everybody who's looking and watching. But then when Miles follows this clone to another rooftop, his spider sense goes crazy, he's bombarded by hits on every end, and everything is just too fast. Whether it's the punches, the pain inside his head, or even the cut from a large object that flies right across his chest. And when this happens, he hears a voice say, I think we softened him up enough, brothers. And when he looks up, he just sees all kind of Miles' Moraleses. And when this happens, the one up front with the knives introduces himself as Salim, who we know more specifically was the one who had went to the laboratory earlier, like just off of the knives description. But with seeing him here, he tells Miles that it's time that they had a talk. And so real quick, I want to give a special shout out to the patrons, and we have some new patrons for the month of June. So shout out to Quinn T, shout out to AW225, Jeremy PL, and also Tonio L. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.